Right. So when we talk about segregation, opposition to desegregation and white resistance, I would bet majority of the people in this country instantly think about the South and think about Jim Crow, and it was pretty awful back then, in the South. So I'm not downplaying that, but at the same time, it was pretty brutal as well. White resistance to desegregation in the North and the West, and we don't often teach this, or it's just a footnote, or we call it busing, is a not such a great term for opposing desegregation. But this chapter we're going to kind of talk about how the resistance and came to be, and what it looked like, and outside of the South. To really start, we need to start with what we call the Great Migration, which is a bit of next slide. I'm going to talk about how it's a bit of a whitewashed word. It's like calling slavery, the transatlantic slave system, migration. When oftentimes there's a lot more to it. But then there was definitely a lot more to Black people leaving the South. But I'm going to play this Vox video really quickly, just kind of give an overview of the Great Migration, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about what that actually meant for people that were participating.
This map shows the Black Belt of the United States. Its name comes from the fertile soil associated with the region. And for most of America's history, more than 90% of the country's largest minority group lived here. Starting in the early 20th century, nearly half of the African American population left this region to resettle in emerging northern and midwestern cities. It was one of the largest internal migrations in U.S. history, and now data indicates that a new movement is taking shape. To understand why, let's go back to 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery and started a new era for colored people in the states. Shortly after, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments enfranchised people of color at large. For the first time, the majority of Black Americans controlled their own destinies. In the years immediately following emancipation, most freed slaves chose to stay in their communities. After all, the only America they had known was the South. It was common for their descendants to work as sharecroppers on plantations. Sometimes their only payment was permission to live on the property. But that wasn't the worst aspect of the South for Blacks.
The Jim Crow caste system determined where you could eat, what platform you stood on when you were catching a train. This was a rigid caste system in which any breach of the caste system could literally mean your life.
That's author and journalist Isabel Wilkerson. She spent 15 years compiling the stories of Black exodus to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. The movement would come to be known as the Great Migration.
The Great Migration was really seeking a political asylum within the borders of our own country. Many of them were fleeing for their lives. They were fleeing a caste system, a rigid caste system known as Jim Crow, in which everything that you could and could not do was based on what you looked like.
In 1915, African Americans began to leave the Black Belt for these new industrial centers. By 1929, 1.5 million African Americans had resettled in new northern metro areas. At the time, America's participation in World War I drove demand for manufacturing labor, but strict immigration laws left northern factories with a shortage of workers. Factories in the North started recruiting low-skilled workers from the South. The workers faced discrimination in their new homes, which culminated in the Red Summer of 1919. Migrant Blacks, whites, and European immigrants were all competing for limited housing and resources, which exacerbated relationships in city centers. The most prominent of these settlements for migrating Blacks was New York City, and the art, music, and theater that emerged from this community became known as the Harlem Renaissance. These artistic achievements redefined the cultural image of Blacks in America. But the stock market crash of 1929 and ensuing Great Depression slowed the influx from the South and effectively ended the first migration. The second wave began in the 40s, when World War II kickstarted manufacturing again, while agricultural employment in the South plummeted. Once again, people living in the rural South began to migrate to cities. Manufacturing hubs in the West were far more prominent in this second movement, but only a fraction of skilled labor positions went to African Americans. That kind of discrimination was a common experience for participants in the Great Migration. Throughout history, the segregated neighborhoods that Southern Blacks flocked to often became the ground centers of massive, racially motivated rioting. In most cases, the protesting began in response to perceived unfair treatment of the Black community. This is a trend that continues today, as seen in modern violent protests in Baltimore, Ferguson, and Milwaukee. By the end of the second migration, an estimated 5 to 8 million blacks had resettled outside of the South.
All right. So this video goes on a little bit longer. Definitely recommend checking out the whole video. But I really like how it connects the situations that Black people, when they moved to, the North and the West, were trapped and many times they're trapped in this concentrated poverty where they couldn't escape, and that, is directly linked to where we see, a lot of unrest today, in places like Ferguson. And that's a direct result to the history of the past, um, give or take 100 years. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. I like that Isabel Wilkerson had something to say on that last video. A really great book, The Warmth of Other Suns. A lot of stories about people who did this great migration. But I really like Brian Stevenson. He talks a lot about what that really meant. This great migration. We played a bunch of his videos earlier, but I want to read this one quote. When he says, African Americans in these communities did not come as immigrants looking for economic opportunities. They came as refugees, exiles from lands in the South where they were being terrorized. And those communities have particular needs we've never addressed. We never talked about. We've got generational poverty in these cities and marginalization with Black communities, and you cannot understand these present day challenges without understanding the Great Migration and the terror and violence that sent the African Americans to these cities where they've never really been afforded the care and assistance they needed to recover from the terror and trauma. So when we think about the Great Migration, and again, oftentimes we teach it like everyone, oh, Black people just move to these cities because there's economic opportunities, and yes, that is part of it. But another part of it was, they were dying in the South. I mean, there was no economic opportunity for Black people. They were stuck in sharecropping. They were they had Black codes and Jim Crow laws that were like throwing them in jail and being leased out in convict leasing. There was lynching. There was white terrorism, voter suppression. There was so much going on right now, but at the same time, the entire Southern economy was based on, exploited labor, horrifically exploited labor in industrial agriculture. So they needed, to continue to exploit Black people. So it wasn't, they did not want Black people to leave. Many Black people that were leaving, many of the 6 million Black people that left, they had to leave in the middle of the night. You didn't tell anybody. There was like KKK, patrols and railroad stations trying to prevent people from leaving. A lot of Black people were lynched for leaving. They were really, escaping terrorism in many ways. A lot of people refer to them, they were internal refugees trying to, escape, Southern terrorism. And a lot of them thought, if they could just get out of the South where there was Jim Crow, that, if they make it to these northern cities and western cities that didn't have Jim Crow, that things would be much better. And unfortunately, in many ways, things were just as bad. They were forced to live in concentrated poverty and racial segregation. They were forced, to send their kids to terrible schools. They had, subpar, hospitals and resources and community, resources and funding. They were disinvested, over, the 20th century. And they lived in this really awful racial hierarchy that was enforced by police terror. The minute they got into it, the police were the border patrol between these white communities and these new Black communities. And eventually, if you, and then on top of that, like all this federal policy that we'll talk about in a second, about that kept them into this concentrated poverty while investing into these white communities and really creating this racial wealth gap that we see today. Brenton Mox writes, Northern whites believe African American migrants were criminal by nature, which was a justification for why these cities didn't offer the assistance the new migrants needed. So all this like stereotypes and these myths and then like about Black criminal mythology, all these internalizations, it wasn't, even though they were created in the South, they spread all over the country. And so a lot of people, white people who had never experienced Black people and didn't know much about Black people were told these awful stories. They had minstrel shows and things, going around, pushing these stereotypes to the point that, when Black people started arriving, a lot of white people were scared or, or concerned. And that's, that justified, keeping them in this concentrated poverty, defunding their assistance and resources, and brutalizing them with police violence. Brian Stevens writes, "We created a narrative of racial difference in the country to sustain slavery, and every people who didn't own slaves bought into that narrative, including people in the North. We were all complicit in the institution of slavery, and the same is true in the era of racial terror and lynching. The North and the Congress basically gave up on equality for African Americans, and that set us on the course that we have not yet recovered from." I want to play this real quick clip about Brian Stevenson and talking a little bit about the Great Migration and how that relates to lynching that was happening in the South during this time period, where 4,000 some Black people in the South were lynched while people were trying to escape in this the South.
Today, we see people leaving countries that are the places where they were born and have lived because there's a threat of violence so great that they can't stay. It's just not rational to stay. That's what happened in America. In the first decades of the 20th century, nearly 6 million African Americans fled from the American South to the North and West. Millions of Black people fled their homes, their land, their families because they weren't safe. And this movement of African Americans from the South to the North and the West represents one of the largest mass migrations in the history of the world. I think it was a forced exodus. It was people being terrorized to the point where they had to flee. This mass movement of people radically changed the American South, but it also radically changed the urban North and West. That movement of people is a story that we need to understand if we want to understand those communities today.
Right. So we had a whole section on Reconstruction and lynching. And I definitely recommend definitely checking that out because that's going to kind of set the context of what's begins to happen in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s as white resistance meets civil rights movement. So as they're moving to, so not only do they, they have, they're forced into these neighborhoods, forced into concentrated poverty. They have racial violence, from police and all these different things happening. But at the same time, we start seeing this, massive amount of federal funding being invested into white communities while disinvesting into these Black communities, and it really just like amplified this concentration of Black poverty that we have going on. And if you really want to understand, like, the Color of Law is probably one of the best books out there about housing discrimination, directly linked to the New Deal and the Federal Housing Administration and all the different policies that followed, stem from that. Our next class is actually going to be on housing discrimination, so we're going to have a deep dive into the history of housing discrimination. So this slide is just going to be a kind of a quick overview, but we're going to go really in depth about this. And the entire class is going to be about housing and banking discrimination. But at first, say you have Black people arriving into these cities, and anytime, most of them couldn't find places to live in white neighborhoods. They had to go, pay this predatory, fees to live in these like subpar Black housing. So not only were paying more money, they're living, they're getting less from it. But at the same time, you start seeing, white people, we talk about white flight as like a bunch of personal choices, like, Black people move in the community, white people get scared, and then they leave, to the suburbs. And that's, definitely part of it. But when we really talk about white flight, what we really mean is federal housing. We mean federal, funding. A massive federal funding called the New Deal that really paved the way for white flight. And that New Deal, you have to understand, FDR is in the middle of a Great Depression. he needs to, he wants to, launch this new deal to kind of kickstart the economy, kickstart his country, create a new middle class. So he focuses on several different things, like worker protections and safety nets, and social security, right to unions and things like that. And then housing is big, a big one as well. But unfortunately, at this time, the South was a solid block of white supremacy. Not only were Black people, the vote was suppressed. Black people really couldn't vote, and since Civil War up until they had a brief time period during Reconstruction, and then 5 or 6 years of and then after that, from the 1877 all the way to the 60s, the 65 Voting Rights Act. I mean, most Black people could not vote in the South. Not only that, their bodies were being counted for representation, proportional representation. So white people were getting extra power in the South, and because they had such as dominated voting block, that and they basically stopped any piece of legislation from passing that benefited Black people in any way. So FDR, or I don't know if it was FDR who actually did the negotiating, but basically FDR's administration, they wanted to pass this these bills, these New Deal bills. So they had to come up with clever ways to exclude Black people from all these new benefits. So like for workers' protections and Social Security and all that stuff, and workers' rights, they basically excluded the two industries, farmer worker and domestic worker, from these benefits. These were two industries where majority of Black people worked in. So they were specifically excluded because of the majority of Black people were working in these two industries. In many ways in the South, that was like the only industries they could work on, where it was either be a sharecropper or a domestic, a domestic house worker. So that's how they excluded, Black people from majority, all the protections and the safety nets. But then housing was a big one. They wanted to, FDR wanted to create housing. He knew that housing was one of the best ways to accrue wealth in this country. But at the same time, during the Great Depression, there used to be, some housing insurance and things like that, but all of that got wiped out. So basically, if you wanted to buy a house, you had to basically pay half up front, and then the bank, and then you had about 3 or 4 years, to pay the rest of the second half, because the bank was so worried that there was really no protection. Like if you walked away, the bank would just eat, that funding. So basically only rich people were buying houses at the time. So FDR creates this Federal Housing Association to essentially, have government backings and ensure these housing loans, to push banks to not only give more loans, but also give more reasonable loans. Like, the loans that we see today on the mortgages, where it's like you only need to, pay, a little bit up front, and then you got 20 or 30 years to pay the house off. So he creates this, but again, he's got to find a clever way to exclude Black people. So at the time, the federal government, due to some Supreme Court cases, they couldn't, specifically discriminate with housing for Black people. But the private industry, the real estate industry, could. It was legal for them to discriminate. So what the government did is they hired the real estate industry to the private one to create risk assessment maps for banks in every municipality in this country. So they created these color coordinated maps based on different levels of risk, but instead of really looking at like true risk, they just based it completely on color. So like, red is like, can't ever get a loan. So that's basically Black communities. Yellow and green are like, different combinations of mixed communities that it's hard to get a loan. And blue is like all white. I think I have the colors. I mean, definitely redlining. I mean, that's where redlining comes for. It's basically majority of Black people. They got that red, risk assessment, meaning that no banks would give out loans. And not only did that, that occur for the Federal Housing Association, but it also continued for things like public housing and GI bills and all this other stuff. They started basing this on the same redlining. And ultimately, I mean, this was huge because ultimately between 1934, when the Federal Housing Association was created and started backing loans, in 1968, the Fair Housing Association or Fair Housing Act that outlawed redlining, even though it took little bit longer to actually outlaw. In many ways, it's still happening today. But between that period of 34 years, 98% of home loans went to white people. So that's an enormous amount of wealth that's being accrued, for white communities, for white people, that's being reinvested, in generation after generation. You can take, money out against your mortgage to, you start a business or send your kids to school. So all this is like just continuing to, just to multiply itself of wealth. At the same time, black people are staying in their concentrated poverty because they can't even get a loan to move out of their concentrated poverty. So and not only that, it wasn't just home loans too. The Federal Housing Association, invested, billions of dollars into building new, homes. In 1934 to 1968, they invested 120 billion into building new home constructions, and all of that was for white people. 1943, the peak of the Federal Housing Association, it financed 80% of all private home construction, all for white people. They even, the GI Bill, with the Federal Housing Association would have these, investments, all this funding to build entire suburbs, where they, this is one example of this, Levittown, Pennsylvania, thousands of houses, but they all had these racial covenants where basically you couldn't, you weren't even allowed, you couldn't sell, developer couldn't sell the house or rent the house to anyone non-white, and white people, even the owners, couldn't do the same. So that, and at the same time, you have the GI Bill that's like, not only is about housing, but it's also about, all this money for returning, veterans in World War II. It's all this money for education and healthcare and college and all these other things, including housing. And then you have the Federal Highway Acts, that pour in more money, that end up, building, these highways through black poor communities, displacing them with little compensation in order to, give access to these new suburbs. And then you got, deindustrialization, all the industries that were in the city where black people were living and move out, follow all the white people. Then you have all these, neoliberal disinvestments. We're going to talk more about this in the next class, but eventually what you basically have is over the last, last 100 years, you just have this massive disinvestment into black communities to the point where, white people on average have 16 times more wealth than black people. The majority of the wealth in this country is accrued, is in white people's hands. And that's a lot of that has to do with, the New Deal and the GI Bill's exclusion. And, the New Deal did a lot of good, and we have to understand it didn't do any, much good for non-white people. It was mainly a white person. So then, when you had these white people, are moving to these suburbs, it's not just that they're, white people are leaving. They're also taking, all this federal funding. They're taking their jobs. They're taking schools. They're taking their tax base, their political power. They're taking all of this, all this wealth that was accrued during slavery, during Jim Crow, during, that was, New Deal, and they're taking that out of these cities and moving them to these suburbs where they, continue to accrue and increase in wealth while the cities get, more underfunded and more underfunded. And then it's to the point that, and we see the situation that we have right now with this massive, racial wealth gap. I'm going to read this. Ibram Kendi writes this, just to give an example, just with the GI Bill, he says more than 200,000 war veterans used the bill's benefits to buy a farm or start a business. 5 million purchased new homes, and almost 10 million went to college. Between 1944 and 1971, federal spending for former soldiers in this model welfare system totaled over 95 billion. As with the New Deal welfare programs, however, black veterans faced discrimination that reduced or denied them the benefits. Combined with the New Deal and the suburban housing construction and the development that found legal ways to keep blacks out, the GI Bill gave birth to the white middle class and widened the economic gap between the races, a growing disparity, racist blame, on poor black fiscal habits. So even, so again, we'll talk way more about this. We'll really dive into the nuts and bolts of all this next class, but it's important to understand that not only did all this happen, but then in the 60s, when we outlawed this, a lot of these practices, we basically just outlawed it and say, our bad, there's no, compensation for all, no effort to heal all the things that, they're just like, we recognize that we screwed you all over, and we're just going to stop it now and just move forward. And anytime the Black communities would try, complain or ask for reparations or ask, for further, reforms, all of a sudden there's this new movement of white people who are saying, well, you guys are just lazy. You're not good with money. There's something wrong with Black culture. There's an absentee Black, father myth that's completely bogus, and Black fathers actually, CDC found them to be more involved with families than white fathers, but but they come up with all these narratives that basically say, well, we outlawed racism, so you guys are all free to, there's no problems anymore. If there is problems, it's all on you, And so Nixon and Reagan really cultivate this, not only cultivate this, but culturally speaking, and in media, but also cultivate this and legally, and why they, they flood the Supreme Courts and federal judges with very conservative anti-civil rights, judges that basically make it impossible to enforce civil rights bills from the 60s. So that's just a little bit of background. So now we want to kind of see, what does this mean? How does it actually play out? So HA Plus did this really great series on Chicago. I actually combined two videos, or I edited it down and combined two videos. I think it's like maybe 10 minutes or so. But it talks about not only about the history of redlining and all that, but also how that directly affects the public schools today.
Chicago's segregation is best explained on a map. You have your north side, you have your south side, and you have your west side. To the east is the lake.
Those terms, north, south, and west, have subtle meanings that relate to the racial segregation of Chicago. And so when you say the north side, people are sometimes subtly meaning the white side. And the south side, especially today, is predominantly Black. And so when you say the south side, you are subtly meaning the Black side.
Chicago is very territorial. Like for me growing up, it was, okay, I know not to go to Bridgeport. Like this is a place that's not really welcoming to African Americans.
This geographic segregation is no accident. It was engineered over years of deliberate policies. In the early 1900s, Chicago was largely a city of white immigrants. The Great Migration of the 20th century brought millions of Black Americans out of the violent Jim Crow South, hoping for a better life. By the end of the 1940s, nearly 500,000 Black Americans lived in Chicago, mostly in a small corridor on the south side called the Black Belt. As the Black population increased, they faced housing practices that were completely racist, and yet completely legal. One of the worst was a practice called redlining, which allowed banks to refuse home loans to Black residents wanting to move into mostly white neighborhoods. This happened to cities nationwide, from Chicago to Oakland to Baltimore. Realtors and homeowners signed restrictive covenants saying they wouldn't sell to Black families in those white neighborhoods. And after World War II, the federal government subsidized white veterans with low-interest loans for fresh new homes in suburbia, complete with big yards and highways to get there.
The federal government was basically saying neighborhoods that are racially integrated are high-risk neighborhoods, and so we're not going to insure those mortgages in those neighborhoods. So they were supporting a suburbanization that led to predominantly white suburbs and predominantly Black urban neighborhoods.
Meanwhile, realtors often participated in shady practices.
There were brokers that would go into a block and they may move a minority female with her 4, 5, or 6 children into a 2-bedroom house. And they would go down the block telling folks, well, they're here. Your values are going to depreciate. Your daughters will be raped. And which meant now what we can do is we can help you get out of here before it's too late.
Brokers would cheat those white homeowners by buying those homes at a low price, and then turn around and cheat the Black homeowners by selling them those same homes at an inflated rate. These practices continued even after the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which made it illegal to refuse to sell or finance a home based on someone's race. So if Black families couldn't get loans to move to the suburbs or white neighborhoods in the city, what was left for them?
Black folks were living in the older parts of the city where overcrowding had very much led to the deterioration of housing in Black neighborhoods. And so Black Chicagoans needed decent, safe, affordable housing.
The answer in the post-war era was public housing.
Public housing was welcome. These were brand new buildings built in a style that at that time was awesome. These high rises with elevators and with big green spaces in front of them. So public housing began as paradise for many families. It was an escape from what was deteriorating housing after many decades of overcrowding. So that was the golden age of public housing in the 1940s, 50s, early 60s.
But these paradises were also isolating, and by the 70s and 80s, these high-rises became as bad as the housing they sought to replace, with a concentration of poverty that led to violence, gangs, and drug abuse. As a result, support for public housing waned.
Through their sheer force of humanity, had to maintain their own community because the city and the federal government had very much abandoned them.
I remember these high-rise buildings like Cabrini Green and the Robert Taylor homes, which everyone called the projects. Family and friends told us not to go there. My high school English teacher called them prisons for the poor. In 2000, the city started demolishing them to try to clean up the neighborhoods. But today, while the projects may be gone, many of the people who lived in them are still suffering from the effects of poverty.
What happens is that people think that this is only a Chicago issue. You know, Baltimore, Detroit, Philadelphia, urban places in this country are all dealing with these same issues, a legacy of segregation that has roots in housing, inequity, and violence comes along with that.
These cities continued to suffer from their divisions. From 1955 to 1970, 62% of blacks and only 4% of whites across America were raised in poor neighborhoods. Half a century later, those numbers haven't changed. Yes, the whites-only signs are gone, and the rate of black poverty has decreased. But the scars of a segregated city run deep, from poor healthcare access to lack of jobs, and yes, violence. And all of this makes me wonder, how do these color lines affect the city's most vulnerable, its kids?
The Chicago public school system is horrible, to say the least. I've gone through 13 years of schooling, and I had never read a book.
When I went off to college, I wasn't prepared at all.
Our communities that need the resources the most to get students to college are the ones that lack it.
Driving through the streets of Chicago, my hometown, it's not hard to see the difference from one neighborhood to the next. Take Halsted Street, the backbone of Chicago. You can start on Halsted in Lincoln Park on the north side, where rows of beautiful townhouses line the street. But travel south 10 miles until you reach 63rd Street, just around the corner from Harold's Chicken, and suddenly you're in a very different part of town. Nowhere is the difference more startling than in Chicago's public schools.
So this right here used to be an elementary school. This is one of the 50 schools that Rahm shut down. The community suffers. When you have the property value suffers, you got boarded up houses, vacant lots. I mean, this community is filled with no hope. There's something about life in a segregated city that produces generations of children who don't get anywhere near the potential to realize the potential they had when they were born.
Troy was removed from his position as a school principal last year after criticizing Mayor Rahm Emanuel's mismanagement of the school system. In Chicago, most students are Black and Latino, and only 9% are white. About 86% of all of its students are low income.
They came to us from unstable housing conditions. They came to us homeless. They came to us hungry. They came to us with the trauma that comes from being in a neighborhood where violence is sometimes a regular occurrence.
This trauma that so many of the students have didn't appear out of nowhere. It came from decades of segregation policies that have kept people of color separate in low-income neighborhoods without access to basic resources like quality healthcare and economic opportunity.
What was it about my life in Bronzeville? What was it about my life in Back of the Yards? What was it about my life in all-Black Inglewood that led me to have such a low assessment of myself?
Chicago Public Schools, or CPS, has been strapped for cash for years, and long argued that despite having 20% of the students in the state of Illinois, it only receives 15% of the state's education funding.
At my elementary school, the walls were definitely peeling. The books were breaking apart. Rarely got new books, like new reading books for the students, unless someone donated them.
When I moved here, I thought, what in the hell is this? Why don't we have this? Why don't we have that? And I would get stuff like, we used to have that. We used to have this. And I think there was just no real broad plan around, like, how do you support small, high needs high schools?
Tilden lost nearly $200,000 last year because of enrollment declines and budget cuts. And after his school improvement grants expired, Swinney had to lay off his clinical staff who were helping his most troubled students.
Once we lost those people, we felt it. You feel it when I can't say, so what's going on? Okay, let me go and connect you with Miss So-and-so. It's like, no, Maurice, you're the clinician right now. Let's have a seat and sit down. Let's figure this out.
In 2015, Mayor Rahm Emanuel announced $200 million in school budget cuts and 1,300 staff layoffs across the district. I was impressed by Principal Swinney's ability to persevere in spite of all of these odds.
When you look at the majority of the kids in the Chicago public school system is Black. It's the urban communities, are minorities. And then you say, how come all the politicians and everybody with money send their kids to private schools? Because they know that the public school system is horrible.
For parents, knowing how to choose a school is really complicated. There are charter schools, selective enrollment schools, magnet schools, and then your regular neighborhood schools.
I think parents make the best choice that they can. I think parents want their students to be successful. Parents are trying to give their children the best opportunity.
But this concept of school choice is criticized as detrimental to communities. As parents choose to send their kids sometimes hours away to charter or selective enrollment schools, for example, there is little confidence left in the local neighborhood schools. And because funding is directly tied to enrollment, fewer students means less funding.
I'm worried because I know for myself as a first generation college student, I know the difference that a quality education has on kids. I just need for her to be at a place that is going to equip her with the academic and social emotional skills that she needs to be able to be successful.
Despite the budget cuts, since 2010, CPS has spent hundreds of millions on the construction of new schools and expensive additions, but mostly to schools that serve white middle-class students. And many have blamed those in power for making decisions not in the interest of local students, but in order to profit off the school system. In April, the former head of CPS was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison for corruption.
We live in a system that will look at the education of that child and sabotage it on purpose, will intentionally not give that child what you'll give another child who happens to be white, right? Both babies beautiful, both babies deserve it.
When it was time for G2 to choose a school for his own son, he struggled with the choice of sending him to a lower resource neighborhood school.
My son is not as beautiful as any other child. He's not as intelligent, as brilliant. When I look at him, stars go off in my head.
In 1971, the Supreme Court did attempt to desegregate U.S. public schools with busing. And for the most part, it worked. Minority students fared better at integrated schools. And by 1988, integration had reached its peak. But for many reasons, the busing efforts stopped, and today, public schools across the nation, including in Chicago, are almost as segregated as they were in the 1960s.
When you don't invest in young people, you get unemployment, you get crime, you get violence. So you get blighted communities when you don't invest in the people from those communities.
All right. So one thing I forgot to mention in the previous chapter was another form of school choice. It's called selective enrollment. And those schools, Chicago, big on selective enrollment, but you can find this all over. It's basically schools that will reserve 30% of the population or their seats for the highest performing students applying to their school. So if there's like 1,000 kids applying to the school, they'll take the first 30% of seats they'll take from the highest performers, and then they go into order. So and that again, yeah, I mean that kind of those schools are often well off schools that are getting even more well off while taking the highest performing kids and then also leaving public schools that are underfunded to even less funded as well. But, anyway, so yeah, I want to talk. I want to show this real quick before I jump into busing. Busing was the last thing they mentioned in that Chicago video, and that's what it's going to be what we're going to mostly talk. We're about to jump into, but really quickly, I'm guaranteed that most people have seen this image of these, very high class white people holding an assault rifle and a gun to Black Lives Matters rallies. And I found this, I found this really interesting. There was this really great article that talked about, you know, uh, what this really meant, So I'll give you a background. So there was this, this is during George Floyd protests. There was this big call for defunding police, and St. Louis, and they sent that, a letter with all kinds, tons of activists signed on this letter saying, please defund police. And if you're not familiar with defund police, it's not literally like let's get rid of police. It's let's take some of the money that we give to police who are over policing communities, and let's give it, let's move that around to more social services and things that can respond to situations without resulting from violence. So they're asking for this, and the mayor was super, anti this idea, and it was crazy. Like she doxed all the signators, and she got onto Facebook Live and read out everyone's names, and I believe it started out a bunch of personal information as well, with the hopes of of people would retaliate against these people. It was crazy. So immediately there was this huge Black Lives Matter protests. And a lot of them, this is a perfect example of St. Louis. St. Louis is, there's a lot of written about, it was really hardcore redlined, really very segregated. It's a perfect example. You have this one community that's almost all Black, that's, the average income is 22,000. And then directly across this line that used to be, a red line, basically, there's this mostly white community with, higher incomes and much more expensive housing, and then there's the mayor's house on the bottom. And so they Black Lives Matter rally, they marched through this neighborhood to get to the mayor's house, and a lot of this neighborhood happens to be a gated community, which is a whole nother issue. But gated communities are basically communities that were able, through different ways, were able to privatize their streets and essentially own the streets and own the sidewalks. So you can't literally it's crazy. I still don't. Yeah, it's crazy that this exists. But anyway, so they the protesters go to the gate. They're walking through the streets, and then a lot of these rich white people get very nervous, and these McCluskeys in particular come out with the guns aimed at them, assault rifles, and they're actually the attorney general, I think, is pushing charges. It's an ongoing court case about I can't remember all the details, but it's worth checking out. But it's a perfect example of just the results of redlining and results of all the things we talked about, and how segregatedly divided, socially economically divided our communities are, and that's a huge reason why we're seeing all this unrest and uprisings and things like that. But I just found it was really interesting because they actually, the RNC, the Republican National Committee, this year, they do big convention right before their election to with lots of fancy speeches, and they're supposed to talk about their agenda and things, it was a crazy Republican National Convention. I mean, it was Trump's, convention is what you expected, but they invited these people on to talk about, the dangers of getting rid of a lot of these housing discrimination that's still going on, like single family units. Like in this community, you can't build a multi-family unit. You can only build single family units, which are really, oftentimes expensive homes, and multi-family units are when, are much cheaper and then more likely to be affordable housing. So it's another way, even though housing discrimination is supposed to be outlawed, it's another way to continue housing discrimination. So, and they're going to talk about a little bit about it, okay, I'm just going to play this video.
They're not satisfied with spreading the chaos and violence into our communities. They want to abolish the suburbs altogether by ending single-family home zoning. This forced rezoning would bring crime, lawlessness, and low-quality apartments into now thriving suburban neighborhoods. President Trump smartly ended this government overreach, but Joe Biden wants to bring it back. These are the policies that are coming to a neighborhood near you. So make no mistake, no matter where you live, your family will not be safe in the radical Democrats' America.
It's just a little tidbit of I mean, that's, you know, the whole convention was that kind of rhetoric. But I mean, it just shows you, like, you know, this, like, this, you know, why they want to continue segregation, why, you know, how they like water it down. You know, oh, I have nothing against black people, I just, you know, believe in single family units, which is, you know, but the end result is, like, you know, it's you know, punishing black, you know, discriminating against black people. So um all right, like I said, the next class is going to be, you know, really deep into, you know, housing discrimination and things like that. I want to play this a little bit of a tidbit before we jump into busing. It's about an interview with Dr. King, where he talks about, you know, why, you know, you know, segregation was so much harder to outlaw in the North and the West than it was in the South.
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954, when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions. People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment, or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they're coming to see them, because before, the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they're coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger? And then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in 64 and even 65 with the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question. And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now? That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we're getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you
So if there's one thing that really captures Northern and Western resistance to desegregation in schools, it's busing. And unfortunately, we have a a somewhat, distorted, we teach a distorted history of busing. Like we teach that, it was something that we tried, it didn't work out well, everyone was angry, and we got rid of it, which is pretty far from the actual truth. Which we'll talk about how, busing really, played out over the next couple slides. But busing, in the early, in the 1970s, there was this realization 20 years after, or like 15 years after Brown versus Board, that most schools weren't, attempting to desegregate. So that's when federal courts got involved, particularly in the North and the West. In the South, there was, significant progress because there was court orders. But in the North and the West, thanks to, a lot of, that provision they included in the 1964 Civil Rights Bill that, said you couldn't enforce desegregation based on racial imbalances, which meant that if the neighborhoods were segregated, it was okay to have segregated schools. Kind of crazy, but so that, the North and the West really used that to kind of protect their desegregation, and that's where the federal courts realized that this was really messed up. They came in and started ordering, school districts to start, using busing, and because of there was residential segregation. You had a white community and a black community, and the 1964 bill said, well, we can't do much about that. You just, it's got, here's a school for the black community and a school for white community. But in the reality, one, that was unconstitutional thing, from according to the Brown versus Board, and two, black schools were suffering pretty badly from this makeup. The setup, so federal courts came in and started ordering, well, you need to come up with busing plans, where you start busing white kids to black schools and black kids, to white schools. And this was something that, this was been, the South, this has been, happening in the South, as well. This isn't some like new thing, that came about, particularly busing. Busing's been around for a long time. But unfortunately, before Brown versus Board, busing was used as a way to, maintain segregation, where if there was white people living in the black community, that they set up busing plans to bus those white kids to the white community school, So, and no one had a problem with busing at that point, but we always start seeing resistance to busing when we start when it started being used to desegregate. And busing became this like kind of dog whistle, this this race neutral initiative that covered up the reality of why they were being resistance, which they were resisting desegregation. People weren't resisting busing; they were resisting, white parents were resisting desegregation, and that's really important because we teach it like everyone was angry about busing. It was just so inconvenient. When in reality, busing has been around for a long time. No one had problems with busing until it started being used to desegregate. But so in the 1970s, the federal courts start ordering, districts all over the country to start, using busing again. Like, this was already happening in many districts, particularly in the South. They were already being ordered, but in the North and the West, they were, they needed federal courts to kind of step in and say this needs to happen. And they found immediately they start seeing a huge amount of success. I mean, there was a lot of jokes about but they're true. I mean, there was humor, but there was also this like this truth to it was that immediately uh, you knew that desegregation was happening because all of a sudden there'd be construction crews at black schools fixing the school up because white kids were going to come to these schools, and at the time I mean these horrible schools were okay for black kids, but they weren't okay for white kids. So and that's really important. A lot of times we only concentrate on the fact that black kids were being bused to white schools, and that was important. A lot of people got a really great black kids got really great education because they were participating in these really nice white schools, but at the same time white kids were being bused to black schools. And that's probably even more important because overnight, literally the same day that court order came down and that busing plan was formed, all of a sudden there was an enormous amount of funding for these black schools that was just appeared out of nowhere, and all of a sudden these schools were significantly improved. And what they found is like immediately they start seeing black graduation rates increase, black dropouts, black student dropouts decrease. They see an enormous amount of funding, adequate funding now all of a sudden going to black schools. It was a huge success. I mean, that's the problem. This is one of the most successful things. When we come up with all these different these school choice plans, like, oh, we just need to fund black schools more. We need more charter schools, magnet schools, all this stuff. But reality, I mean, the only program in the history of our country that's actually worked to actually desegregation, to provide equal education is integration. And this was very successful program that actually peaked in the 70s and 80s or early 80s before it was kind of overcame by white resistance. And so, the Supreme Court actually weighed in 1971 because there was a lot of challenges against this, and they actually confirmed, like, yes, this is illegal and constitutional and it needs to actually happen. So we immediately start seeing, resistance, all over the North and the West. At first, a lot of it looked, just like the South at first. So I'll read the Equal Justice Initiative writes this quote, says, after court ordered busing began in Boston, white mothers led the opposition. White mobs attacked buses carrying black students to white schools with eggs, bricks, and bottles. Protesters, students, and bystanders alike were stoned and stabbed and beaten in clashes that continued for weeks until quelled by the National Guard. I mean, if you read that, and you just removed the word Boston, you would instantly think that was, something that was happening in Jim Crow South. But I mean, it's important to understand that this is, our entire country. This isn't just a Southern thing. But there is a distinction, at the same time, Northerners and Westerners, they were really good at kind of, using dog whistles and making it seem like, it wasn't about race. Like the South, it was like, yes, we're segregationists and we're trying to protect the white race, from black, criminals and all this stuff and black rapists, so there was like, they were openly and racist, but in the North and the West, they found these really clever ways to hide their racism. Using like, clever terms like, neighborhood schools. We just want neighborhood schools, we just want busing, or we just don't want busing. It all depends on, if a white community has really nice schools, then they promote neighborhood schools. They just want to support neighborhood schools. But if a white school, there's bad schools in the white neighborhood and there's nicer schools outside, and then all of a sudden they want, open enrollment. So it really, whatever the words or plans are, it's all about maintaining white segregation and keeping the best schools for white students. But many of these leaders of this white resistance, they would say things, there are oftentimes white mothers that would say things like, we're not racist, we respect blacks, our concern is just with education. We just want the best education. Louis Day Hicks was the founder of a huge oppositional group to busing and desegregation called ROAR, Restore Our Alienated Rights is the acronym. But she would often say, I'm not racist. You show me where I said anything against, Negroes or racists. So they were really great at like kind of adapting their racism to make it seem very race neutral. So Matthew Delmont writes in The Lasting Legacy of Busing Crisis, with busing, Northerners have found a palatable way to oppose desegregation without appealing to the explicitly racist sentiments they prefer to associate with Southerners. White parents and politicians frame their resistance to school desegregation in terms like busing and neighborhood schools, and this rhetoric shift allowed them to support white schools and neighborhoods without using explicitly racist language. So they had this huge amount of success on desegregation. They're seeing, all this, benefits, and Black students, increased graduation rates, increased, achievement, decrease of dropouts, and it's doing really well up until, the 80s and particularly in the 90s. And a lot of that had to do with, the court decisions, with Nixon and Reagan. They put, they signed a whole bunch of conservative judges that were not, fans of the 60s civil rights bills and desegregation. So they were able to, on the top, throughout courts, kind of find ways to through many court cases, like setting precedents, to kind of strip away a lot of power. Well, actually, the next section we're going to we're going to go through like all the court cases, that eventually, basically, took the power out, federal desegregation orders. But they had and there was multiple different reasons. They had white resistance, that actually got the white resistance got way more media attention than the pro busing rallies and all the Black students that were benefiting, or all the Black schools that were benefiting that didn't get a whole lot of media coverage. So so it's kind of like the abandonment of the federal government. Nixon and Reagan both were like anti desegregation, but they used a lot, they used the dog whistles of busing and really pushed that, and so it was like the decline of judicial support, the decline of federal government support, having desegregation, presidents like Nixon and Reagan, and just white resistance, and all put that all together. And by the time you hit 80s, they basically stopped desegregation, and at least the improvements. And then we start seeing a resegregation movement, starting in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's the movement where we're at right now. We're moving towards a more segregated education, school systems, that our school systems that have been resegregating and increasing their segregation since the late 80s, early 90s, thanks to this backlash, this white resistance to busing. So I want to read this Atlantic article. It says a generation of students who experienced school desegregation firsthand in 1970s and 80s benefited greatly. In public policy debates and popular memory, though, the perspective of students have been overshadowed by those of anti-busing parents and politicians. As a result, the successes of school desegregation have been drowned out by a chorus of voices insisting busing was an inconvenient, unfair, and failed experiment. And that's really important to understand. I mean, that personally, that's how I learned. I remember, there was like maybe one or two sentences in my history, high school history class, U.S. history, about busing, and it was basically like we tried busing, and it was a huge failure. Everyone hated it, and we moved on. Which is, the narrative that they pushed, that the white resistance push, to kind of to kind of rewrite our history. In reality, it was very farther from the truth. All right, so I pulled three quotes from three really great articles that do a really great job kind of capturing the context of why this resistance to busing came about, how it got started in the 50s and how that translated to federal government intervention and provisions in 1964 civil rights bill, and then how Nixon in the 70s and 80s and how they're able to actually use this resistance to kind of help completely stop desegregation in its tracks in the 80s. So definitely recommend reading all three of these articles if you want more, but I just pulled these really three great quotes, and sorry about the length. In the 1970s, this is from Cheryl Ifill, who wrote In the Same Myths That Thwarted Busing Are Keeping School Segregation Alive. She wrote, in the 1970s, forced busing became a convenient narrative of government overreach. It was particularly exploited by Richard Nixon during the 1972 presidential campaign, gaining wide traction among white moderates and liberals. It allowed whites to excuse themselves and their neighbors for violent opposition to integration that, when caught on camera in cities like Boston, often appeared no different from the widely condemned actions of white parents and students attempting to block the entrances of Black students to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. So again, basically we signed the history of a violent opposition to the South when in fact, if you look at the particularly in places like Boston, if we look at the white resistance that was going on, there, it was just as violent. It was pretty awful. But we were able to, instead of talking about, that, we were able to, use this like narrative force busting, like it was forced onto us, and we were forced to do all these things for government overreach. And it was a really great dog whistle that Nixon Nixon was one of the first presidents to win an election based on a very strong dog whistle campaign that he used for like law and order, silent majority, all these things that were dog whistles for increasing anti-Black policies, winning white voters for anti-Black policies. And a big one that he used was forced busing. So he never talked about desegregation. He never talked about how he opposed desegregation or how it wasn't happening, in certain areas. He just focused on forced busing as a government overreach. So Matthew Delmont writes in the article that there's a generational shift in the debate over busing. The controversy was driven by white opposition to school desegregation, not by the use of school buses. Students in the United States have long ridden buses to school. Buses made the modern public school system possible, enabling multi-grade elementary schools and comprehensive high schools to replace one-room schools. Buses have long been used in the South, as well as New York, Boston, and many other northern cities to maintain segregation. This form of transportation was not controversial for white parents, but more starkly, school buses were fine for the majority of white families. Busing was not. White parents in New York City organized in the 1950s to oppose plans to bus Black and Puerto Rico students from overcrowded schools to white schools with open seats. The parents used euphemisms such as busing and neighborhood schools to maintain segregated schools without explicitly saying they did not want their children to go to school with Black and Latinx students. Similar anti-busing protests occurred in Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and other cities in the 1960s. Northern congressmen responded to the anger expressed by many of their white constituents by writing anti-busing provisions in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. These amendments were designed to keep federal civil rights enforcement of school desegregation forced on the South and away from the North. While the Civil Rights Act finally pushed into the South to comply with Brown versus Board of Education by enabling, the withholding of federal funds, cities in the North, Midwest, and West routinely flouted federal authority. While protesters such as Irene Maccabee of Pontiac, Michigan, received massive amounts of media attention for her defiance of court-ordered school desegregation, President Richard Nixon called for Congress to pass a busing moratorium and used televised presidential addresses to signal that he would limit federal oversight to federal oversight to unconstitutional de jure segregation. So that's a Jim Crow segregation. De jure, remember, is specific and explicit in law. Most commonly associated with South to set the terms of busing debate. So Nixon really only wanted to, focus on Jim Crow and ignore, the desegregation happening in the North and the West. Nixon also warned his appointees and lawyers and officials who worked in the Justice Department, Department of Health and Education and Welfare that they can either support the administration's evolving school desegregation policies or lose their jobs. Great example, one of Nixon's, housing, his first, HUD, director was, Mitt Romney's dad. I'm spacing on what his first name was, but he was a Romney. And he was probably one of the best HUD secretaries we had because he really wanted to enforce desegregation, and he started refusing to give money to cities that were pushing policies to maintain segregation. And Nixon eventually got rid of him because I mean he got so much support from white voters by protecting their segregation. And so like at beginning Nixon kind of was like for desegregation, but much like a lot of politicians, even like Biden, we're going to talk about Biden in a second, but Biden was like for desegregation, and then he had some run-ins with some some very angry white voters, and all of a sudden he's like helping pass segregation policies and bills. So a lot of this was dictated by this white resistance, pushing their politicians to, or just, opportunist, politicians, recognizing the power, and the votes they can get by protecting, not only protecting desegregation, but making it a convenient, making it a dog whistle issue like forced busing, and not even using the word desegregation anymore. So Matthew Delmont also writes in The Lasting Legacy of Busing Crisis, with busing, Northerners had found a palatable way to oppose desegregation without appealing to explicitly racist sentiments they prefer to associate with Southerners. I have probably talked to before 500 or 600 groups over the last years about busing, Los Angeles Assemblyman Floyd Wakefield said in 1970. Almost every time someone had gotten up and called me a racist or a bigot. But now, all of a sudden, I am no longer a bigot. Now I am called the leader of the anti-busing effort. White parents and politicians frame their resistance to school desegregation in terms like busing in neighborhood schools, and this rhetoric shifted allowed them to support white schools and neighborhoods without using explicitly racist language. Describing opposition to busing as something other than resistance to school desegregation was a move that obscured the histories of racial discrimination and legal context for desegregation orders. In covering school desegregation in Boston and other northern cities, contemporary news media took up the busing frame, and most histories of the era had followed suit. Americans' understanding of school desegregation in the North is skewed as a result, emphasizing innocent or unintended de facto segregation over housing covenants, federal mortgage redlining, public housing segregation, white homeowners association, and discriminatory real estate practices that produce and maintain segregated neighborhoods, as well as policies regarding school sitting district and students transfers that produce and maintain segregated schools. The crisis in Boston and other cities that faced court-ordered desegregation was about unconstitutional racial discrimination in public schools, not about busing. So that's really important. So one, I mean that, he talks about how, before they came up with this idea of just calling it busing, a lot of these people that are opposing desegregation, were called out, for the racism. But as soon as they start, using words busing, and neighborhood schools, all of a sudden, they were just, concerned parents, even though they're pushing the same exact policies. And then it's important to understand, we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff, housing, discrimination, that creates this residential discrimination and racial imbalance. And that was a particular, strategy because they, instead of actually, desegregating schools, because we've always had power to desegregate schools, instead they're saying, well, we're just the victims of residential, segregation. There's nothing we can do. This is a long history of redlining and public housing desegregation and all this housing discrimination, and we can't affect that. So, this is out of our hands. And you're going to see this, the same excuse used oftentimes. That yes, there's a long history of racial segregation that is causing school segregation, but that doesn't mean we're powerless. We proved in the 70s, we proved that we actually have power and we can segregate through strategies. It doesn't have to be busing, but busing was a strategy. It was like our last resort. School districts had lots of ways, opportunities to figure out desegregation. And it was only, after they refused to, the federal courts came in and pushed, busing, desegregation orders. So, I mean, we do have the power power to desegregate our schools. It's we're not victims of this past history of redlining, but that is something that you'll see, often mentioned by a lot of politicians and a lot of school boards who honestly just don't want to have the courage to stand up to white parents and start desegregating their schools. We're going to talk about, like, Mayor Blasio is a great example, in New York City, that he would often, say, oh, this is a long history of segregation, and it's out of our hands. We just can't do anything about it. When in reality, yes, like, we have a long history of residential desegregation, but we have, we are fully capable of overcoming that and segregating. We've proven that we can in the 70s. But I just want to highlight that, because you'll see that, the more you dive into desegregation in schools, the more you'll see people will resist that, white resistance, kind of, playing the victim of our housing discrimination and our racial imbalance. All right, so I want to play this video and stop talking so much. Yeah, this is a really great video that kind of talks about, what happened in Seattle with school desegregation, and how white parents were able to kind of, get around it, and maintain their segregation.
When you take kindergarten kids and put them on a bus for an hour and a half, when they got a school they could walk to 5 minutes away, well, that's wrong.
I have consistently opposed forced busing to achieve racial balance.
For about a decade there, desegregating America's schools was the biggest political debate in the country.
Many of the Negro parents believe that a predominantly Negro school is inferior per se, but we do not believe that premise.
Mayors made and squandered their careers on it. Millions of families fled to the suburbs. Cities tore themselves apart. But now, in 2017, America's schools are more segregated than they were in the 1960s. The only difference is, white people don't think it's a problem anymore.
Tell us what arrangements you have made for us.
I grew up in Seattle. I want to tell the story of what happened here because I think it's instructive for understanding why segregation was the most urgent problem in America until it wasn't. Unlike the cities you usually hear about, there were never any riots here. No rock throwing, no protests. Like everything else, the racism in Seattle is extremely polite. But is that really the reason our schools are still so segregated? No.
Yes.
All right, so in the beginning, the way it worked was every kid attended the school that was closest to their house. This sounds morally neutral, right? The simplest way of linking kids to the most convenient education. The problem was that Seattle, like every other city in America, forced its minority populations to live in specific neighborhoods. Kids attending their nearest school meant that geographic segregation became educational segregation. So, in a city that was only 3% black, one high school was majority African American, and the other 6 had fewer than 5 black students each. In 1977, Seattle announced that it was going to deliberately desegregate its school system. From now on, instead of going to the closest school, kids would be assigned to the school that would ensure racial balance across the city. White students would take buses to schools in the South End, and minority students would take buses north. What's surprising about this is that at the time, Seattle parents didn't actually kick and scream all that much. This is what happened in Boston after they announced a forced busing plan.
I am white and I want my rights.
In Seattle, though, most of the population wanted integration and supported the busing plan. Well, at least they did until it happened to their kids. Over the next 2 decades, tens of thousands of white parents quietly pulled their kids out of public schools. Here's what happened to enrollment as soon as the busing plan went into place. By 1990, nearly half the kids in Seattle were attending private schools, one of the highest rates in the country. Meanwhile, the public schools themselves went from hella white to barely white. Of course, an absence of white people is not in itself a crisis. But in Seattle, the schools depend on local levies for a huge chunk of their budget. You know those white parents that pulled their kids out of public schools?
Oh my God, Becky.
Each one of them was a voter who now had no interest in keeping the public schools funded at all. The district was afraid that if it couldn't get white parents back to public schools, it would start losing elections and its funding would be cut even more. So, starting in the 1980s, Seattle schools launched all sorts of gimmicks to lure white parents back to the district. They established magnet schools for STEM kids, alternative schools that didn't give grades or homework. And especially, they set up programs within existing schools that separated the gifted students from the general population. Do I even need to tell you what kinds of kids got defined as gifted? By the 90s, it was clear the whole thing wasn't working. Minority kids were being bused an hour away from their homes, only to attend schools that were just as segregated as the city itself.
When they come up here, we won't mess with them, so why when we come up there, they mess with us?
Plus, despite the huge cost, busing wasn't actually narrowing the racial achievement gap, which was supposed to be the whole point. By the late 90s, the desegregation effort had been watered down to something called controlled choice. How it worked was parents ranked the schools they wanted their kids to go to. If a school got more applications than it had spaces, the district was allowed to prioritize ethnic minority kids. That way, the schools in the rich neighborhoods wouldn't end up Munich in 1936. If this plan sounds modest, that's because it was. No one was forced to attend a school they didn't want to. White kids were just a little more likely to get their second choice than black kids were. But for some white parents, it was the last straw. In 2001, a group of Seattle parents sued the district, saying their white kids were being disadvantaged on the basis of their race. The lawsuit eventually made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the justices agreed. Since the government didn't deliberately segregate schools in the first place, deliberately desegregating them amounted to discrimination. Remember this? The Supreme Court basically said it didn't happen. The court said it wasn't racist for schools to be divided by race, it was racist for the government to inconvenience white people by trying to fix it. Since the Supreme Court decision, Seattle has gone back to assigning kids to schools based on where they live. In a shocking twist, the district has ended up just as segregated as it was last time the city did this. But the most alarming thing about the resegregation of Seattle schools is that it's getting more difficult to solve. In the last 10 years, Seattle has become one of the fastest growing cities in America. Rising housing prices have pushed poor and minority populations out of the city altogether. Except not like that, like this. 3 of the school districts right next to Seattle have student populations that are over 70% minority and where half the kids are on free lunch. Meanwhile, these 3 districts are mostly white kids and have almost no poor students at all. The same thing is happening in cities across the country.
All right. So I think that was a great example of not only what happened in Seattle, but I mean, that was very similar to many cities in the North and West. And how the white resistance, included things like white flight to opposition to school desegregation, to literally, suing the district, and then, having the cases go to a very anti-desegregation, a pro-segregation Supreme Court, who came up with arguments that it was actually racist to desegregate schools, which is pretty crazy. Sorry, one more long quote. This is from Nicole Hannah-Jones. Wrote this really great article about "It Was Never About Busing," and just want to read some of these about some of the history. Also, I highlighted a particular passage that kind of talks about Biden's history with segregation, because I know that came up with and during the Democratic primaries, and it's important. He's now our president, so it's important to understand kind of like where he stood exactly, because there's a lot of different information out there. But let me read this from starting Nicole Hannah-Jones article from "It Was Never About Busing." That was even that we even used the word busing to describe what was in fact court-ordered school desegregation, and that Americans of all stripes believe that the brief period in which we actually tried to desegregate our schools was a failure speaks to one of the most successful propaganda campaigns of the last half century. Further explains how we have come to be largely silent and accepting of the fact that 65 years after the Supreme Court struck down school segregation in Brown versus Board of Education, Black children are as segregated from white students as they were in the mid-1970s, when Mr. Biden was working with Southern white supremacist legislators to curtail court-ordered busing. The term busing is Also, I want to say this article came out right after like the Kamala Harris Biden arguments around busing in Democratic primaries. The term busing is a race-neutral euphemism that allows people to pretend white opposition was not about integration, but simply about the desire for their children to attend neighborhood schools. But the fact is that American children have ridden buses to schools since the 1920s. There's a reason that cherry yellow school bus is the most ubiquitous symbol of American education. Buses ease the burden of transportation on families and allow larger comprehensive schools to replace one-room schoolhouses. Millions of kids still ride buses every day and rarely do so for integration. The Republican strategist Lee Atwater, in his famous 1981 interview, made the strategy plain. You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. He actually said the N-word. I'm just not repeating it. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. It was a hallmark of Richard Nixon's Southern strategy during his presidential campaigns, which relied on unifying white anger about fair housing and school integration to build a successful coalition of white Southerners and white ethnic Northerners. After Nixon's win in 1968, white Democrats were trying to hold on to their white voters. Mr. Biden favored busing for integration when he ran for election in 1972, but changed his mind seemingly because of a Delaware school desegregation case that was working its way through the courts. In his autobiography, Mr. Biden recalled his confrontation with a crowd of white constituents teetering on the brink of violence over the issue. Mr. Biden flipped. Between 1975 and 1982, he teamed up with ardent segregationists in Congress, including Mr. Eastland, to support no fewer than 5 anti-busing measures. Despite Mr. Biden's recent claims that he only opposed busing ordered by the Department of Education, the bills tried to curtail the ability of federal courts to order busing and even to limit busing in places where courts had already ordered it. And that's important during that fight in the Democratic primary when Kamala Harris accused Mr. Biden of pushing desegregation, especially like when she herself had actually experienced, she got a great education through, busing, desegregation busing programs, and I believe California, and so she accused him of fighting the thing that helped her and so many of her black friends and students, and then he fell back on the same euphemisms and the same dog whistles that we're talking about right now. He's like, oh, I don't oppose desegregation, I just oppose forced busing, which which is literally opposing desegregation. So that's important to understand. And they're now Kamala's the VP. They made up, and whatever. But I mean, I think it's important just to kind of understand the history that's behind that right now. All right, so going back to the article, to say busing or really mandated desegregation failed is a lie. It transformed the South from apartheid to the place where Black children are now the most likely to sit in classrooms with white children. It led to the increased resources being spent on Black and low-income children. There's a story Black people ruefully tell of the day they knew integration was coming to a Black high school in Charlotte, North Carolina. A crew of workers arrived to fix up the facilities because now white children would be attending. This is how a two-way busing worked and why integration was necessary. White people would never allow their children to attend the types of inferior schools to which they relegated Black children. For years, North Carolina's Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, where the community decided to make busing work, were some of the most integrated in the country, and both Black and white students saw achievement gains. The district was forced to return to neighborhood schools after a white family brought down the desegregation order, and Charlotte is now the most segregated district in North Carolina. We should question why in the narrative of busing, we remember Boston, but not Charlotte. So that's important. When we remember Boston as like this violent opposition to busing, not Charlotte was very successful, case of busing. We now know that school desegregation significantly reduced the test score gap between Black and white children, cut in half for some Black age groups without harming white children. No other reform has reduced the gap on this scale. Rather, the opposite is true. The test score gap between Black and white students reached its narrowest point ever at the peak of desegregation and has widened as schools have resegregated. An economist, and professor of public policy, Rutgers C. Johnson at the University of California, Berkeley, studied the life outcomes of Black children children who got access to the trifecta of quality Head Start, increased school funding, and desegregation, he saw the entire trajectory of their lives change. Compared with kids stuck in segregated schools, even their own siblings, they were more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to get out of poverty. As adults, they even, they earn more, were less likely to go to jail, and even live longer. The earlier and longer these children got access to integrated schools, Dr. Johnson argued, the stronger the results were. So there's been all kinds of studies like that, and proved that the students that like Kamala Harris, who intended these great desegregation programs in the 70s and 80s, they were more likely to graduate high school, more likely to get make a livable income, more likely to escape poverty, and not even that. There's a lot of studies that found generational benefits. Their children were more likely to receive these same benefits based on the success that they got from these, because that's the whole point of public schools. They're supposed to be the great equalizer. They're supposed to allow people a chance to correct a lot of the the imbalances in our society, and that's only going to happen when we have integration, and when we match up the fate of white children who white parents who have the power care much about, with the fates of black children who, when they're segregated, aren't really valued, but when they're integrated, all of a sudden there's construction crews that are coming to fix the facilities. All right, so I want to do a little bit more podcasts. I actually have the next two slides are some more segments of the podcast, Nice White Parents. So this is episode 2. We're talking. We had a previous section. I played some of this. But if you didn't watch the previous section, so Nice White Parents, this is 5 episode, about an hour long episode podcast series about basically about school desegregation, particularly in New York City, and they talked a little bit about the history, but a lot of they follow and how it's still being how segregation is being maintained in New York City, mainly by parents, white parents, who claim that they care about integration, care about civil rights of black children, but at the same time are protecting their ensuring that segregation remains in their school systems. Not necessarily because they hate black people or they want to discriminate, but more that they want to advantage their kids as much as possible, which in turn allows them to disadvantage black children because they maintain most of the power. So it's a really great series. I definitely recommend checking it out. But I highlighted half of basically episode 2, because episode 2 is mainly the history episode, and it talks about a lot of really great history around starting in the 1950s around New York City, because New York City is now one of the most segregated school districts in the country. And that really, that has a long history starting in the 50s with resistance to Brown versus Board. So, the first, definitely, I pulled out a couple quotes for each section. I'm just going to go through each one of these quotes, and then you can pause this presentation and kind of go to either New York Times or Apple Podcasts, websites with Nice White Parents, and just I highlight about half an hour of podcast. You don't need to listen to all of it if you just want to check out certain sections. But the first section is just about the early history of New York school segregation, and it's really about how the segregation was, how the black schools were, and and it really explains how a lot of times black parents and advocates, they weren't worried about diversity. They're more worried about just having adequate education for their black kids, and they realize without integration, it's just our governments were never going to care that much. So May Mallory, she's one of the black parents in that was around in the 50s that talks about how the school systems were, and she said it says this was nothing to do with wanting to sit next to white folks. Integration, May Mallory would say, was about, quote, demanding a fair share of the pie. She said, our children want to learn, and they certainly have the ability to learn. What they need is opportunity. The Board of Education has defined integration as a multiracial choir. It was a virtue in and of itself. May Mallory saw integration as a remedy, a way to get the same stuff everyone else had: functioning toilets, books, certified teachers, a full school day. Integration was a means to the end. Yeah, like some of these black school districts, literally they didn't have, weren't given enough funding to keep their schools open for a full day. Like they had to bring in black kids in shifts. It's crazy what was happening. And then there's the next section I want to highlight, that this is like pattern of reporting and analysis, what I call analysis paralysis, that we see even to this day, where basically they're like, whenever someone brings up this like issue that our schools are really segregated, the first thing the school board and the first thing local politicians do is like, we need to study this. So they put together reports and all this stuff. They study it for years, spend all this money studying this stuff, and then by the time the recommendations come out, it's the same recommendations that every report that's ever been done on schools. It's segregation. It's basically like, yes, you need to desegregate and all with as quickly as possible, but and then they're but it's a different time. They're able to ignore that, and then next time someone mentions it, they just go through the whole cycle. It's crazy. I'm gonna read this quote from the podcast. He says, you see a pattern emerge starting in the late 1950s that looks like something like this. Black parents and civil rights groups would pressure the board to act on segregation. The board would invite its critics to join a commission to investigate the problem. The commission would study the schools, discover extreme segregation, lay out solutions. The Board of Ed would then take a tiny step toward implementing some of the recommendations until white parents start to complain about the changes, at which point the board would back off and say it needed more evidence. Another commission, another report. And this is like this cycle has been happening since the 50s and some of these, particularly in New York cities, but really all over. And it's just this great way to prevent any kind of segregation or desegregation from happening. And then there's the next section, a really cool section where it talks about this huge movement, what many people call like the largest civil rights demonstration in the history of our country. And it's no coincidence that no one knows about this, or at least most people don't know about this. But I read it in this quote: finally, in 1964, 10 years after Brown versus Board, Black and Puerto Rican parents said enough. They were sick of waiting, sick of lawsuits, sick of asking for a remedy, and sick of being ignored. So they went big, spectacularly big. They shut down the schools. They organized a civil rights demonstration that was the largest in U.S. history. 500,000 students stayed home from school, larger than the March on Washington. It was called Freedom Day, a massive school boycott. So it was definitely check it out. It was amazing, activism is amazing, demonstration. But fortunately, this huge demonstration with, wasn't as powerful as a small group of angry white parents, unfortunately. So, but yeah, definitely, I would definitely recommend hearing more about that. And then there's a couple more sections that if you want to check out. The next one is about that. They call the innocence of segregation. They don't mean innocence as like not guilty. That is more, they're talking about like naiveness of and that's really has to do with a lot of white parents who were for integration were really naive about that, what that really meant. So I'm going to read a couple quotes here. It says, American South schools were desegregated with court orders. Cities and counties mandated desegregation, and the schools desegregated. By the early 1970s, the South was the most integrated region in the country, but New York City did not want to do that. No mandates. And New York City Board of Education wanted to appeal to the hearts and minds. They wanted to sell white people on the virtues of integration, have it happen, quote, naturally. I thought about the things we say, nice parents, to each other, and about why we won't send our kids to segregated schools, because they're too strict or too chaotic or too disruptive, because the test scores are bad, because we want more play, we want fewer worksheets. Sorry, I just realized that I think this is a typo. It says why we won't send our kids to, it should be desegregated schools. And that's because they're too strict or too chaotic or too disruptive, because the test scores are bad, because we want more play, we want fewer worksheets, because we don't want to ride a bus, we don't want uniforms. We don't want tests. We want innocence. We need it to protect us from the reality that we are the ones creating the segregation, and we're not sure we're ready to give it up. And then, so that's really important to say, because we make up all these excuses, oh, the school, why we don't send our kids to the desegregated schools, why we maintain them into these white, segregated schools. And oftentimes it's because, oh, the test scores aren't as good, even though we know the test scores are super racist and bad indicators of what's happening. Or we say, I don't like, uniforms, or I don't like this or that, instead of just saying, kind of, admitting, our real feelings about desegregation and how that plays in our choices, which is a hard thing for a lot of people to admit and be aware of, yeah, as well. And then the last thing is that Elaine was not for segregation, but in the end, she wasn't really for integration either. All the choices she made, choices she had the luxury of making, were meant to advantage her own kids. And I understand that, and that's what parents do. So that really gets down to the heart of it, is a lot of times, even with parents that are for integration, or that oppose segregation, just aren't willing to, are still, willing to not include their kids in that decision. So then they choose what they think is best for their kids, which is the segregated white schools. And that's a hard thing to realize. One, we need to kind of start challenging that, what we consider the best. Are test scores the best for our kids, or actual experiences with a diverse, multicultural setting? Is that more better, and it will prepare kids more for our very diverse country? So then two, also, we need to understand how important it is for us to actually live our values, as well. So we're going to talk a lot more about that in the next section. And then the next section is more about northern private schools versus southern segregation academies, and really talks about how in the South, there was clear segregation academies. They were clearly, these religious institutions and private institutions that were setting up ways to get around segregation. They were very open about it and what they were doing. In the North, they weren't, they didn't use those terms. They just opened up private schools that had, way too many obstacles for Black kids to get into, that maintain their segregation, whether it's economically or racist test stores, or whatever they use to keep kids, Black kids out. And then they created these private, schools that are basically, white segregated schools. So it was a much, more race neutral way. And then the last part, battle for defining integration. So this talks about, I'll read this quote. For Black parents, integration was about safe schools for their children, who qualified teachers and functioning toilets, a full day of school. For them, integration was a remedy for injustice. The Board of Ed took that definition and retooled it. Integration wasn't a means to an end, it was a racial harmony and diversity. The board spun integration into a virtue that white parents could feel good about, and their side triumphed. That's the definition of integration that stuck. That's still with us today. So that talks about like this battle between our boards of educations and how they define integration. Because originally integration was just about equal opportunity for Black kids, but they were able to retool that to it's just about diversity and racial harmony. When we know that even desegregated schools are still not integrated, because there's still gifted programs and all the racial biases that go in with having majority white teachers, and there's still a lot of issues going on. So it's really, the last section's just about like what is integration, and this battle between how to define it, because that plays out on the policies that are implemented. So yeah, at this point, feel free pause this presentation, this video, and you don't, like I said, you don't have to check out all of them. I just kind of wanted to highlight different sections, and feel free, I think it's about half an hour of podcast, but feel free to check out what you want, and then come back to this presentation. We have a couple more slides in this section. All right, so I want to just highlight this tool. This is a really great tool by I believe ProPublica created it. it's called Miseducation. Is there a racial inequity at your school? And this, they, I'll just read the description. Based on the civil rights data released by the U.S. Department of Education, ProPublica has built an interactive database to examine racial disparities in educational opportunities and school discipline. Look up more than 96,000 individual public and charter schools and 17,000 districts to see how they compare. So you can, if you're interested to understand like how your schools break down and inequalities between your schools and particularly in white, majority white and majority black, neighborhoods. This is a great tool to kind of see what's happening in your school districts. All right, the last two slides, I just want to talk about, our next section is actually going to be about, kind of where we are with our resegregation, but I wanted to kind of talk about just these two these two issues right now, because it's a great way to see how the past is linking up to the present, particularly with this idea of neighborhood schools. So again, we talked about like this this was a great euphemism for white resistance in the 60s and 70s and 80s, to make it seem not racist. Like we're not for we're not we don't oppose desegregation, we just really like neighborhood schools. And that argument only comes up when there's really nice neighborhood schools in white neighborhoods. When there's really nice white, schools outside of white neighborhoods, all of a sudden, no one cares about neighborhood schools. It's more about we want open enrollment, we want things like that. So, but when there is really nice schools in nice neighborhoods, you see the same things that you would see in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I want to highlight Richmond, because literally they, I mean, the way, there was a recent rezoning plan in last year, or in 2019, 2 years ago now, and basically they realized, well, one, I mean, usually when schools rezone, it was like kind of two issues. One is dealing with overcrowded schools and trying to figure out a way to kind of move around kids so schools aren't overcrowded, because usually not all the schools are overcrowded, just the really nice white schools are overcrowded. And then two, I think there's oftentimes a realization of just how segregated our schools are, so they come up with plans to resegregate. Particularly in Richmond, schools are very segregated today. 70% of the area schools have fewer than 10% white students. So they realized this, and they came up with some rezoning plans. And it was multiple parts. Like I said, one was aimed at relieving overcrowding of some schools, and then other parts were aimed at increasing diversity and resegregating or desegregating schools. And they chose this option called school pairing, which is a really cool option, where basically they take two or more schools and they pair them together and basically make like one giant school out of these two or more schools. And you can use it for a number of different reasons, but what they were going to use it for was as a way to kind of integrate schools. So they took like a poor black school and a really rich white school, and they paired them, or at least that plan was that it would pair them, and then they would have kids attend different schools at different times, and they would share the resources between the schools, share all that. So it was a great, I mean, it's a really awesome way to kind of integrate schools and make sure everyone gets the same education. So that was up for vote. There was of course massive resistance. I just want to read this flyer was part of the Republicans that were pushing this resistance. This one, I'll just read on the this is a photo on the left of 1970 showing "Save Our Neighborhood Schools" being used to fight desegregation programs in Richmond, Virginia, and on the right, the same slogan being used by a Virginia senator. I'm trying to remember what the senator's name. I think you can kind of look down here, but he basically, he led the charge, the white resistance against this rezoning plan, particularly. I mean, he didn't mind about the overcrowding, rezoning plan. It's more about increasing that, the desegregation parts. And he used like the exact same slogans that was used, and it's in Richmond in the 1970s. So it's important to understand that we haven't got that far. This isn't, all things that were just stuck in the past. These are things that still come up today and still, use the same dog whistles and the same strategies. And so they had a massive, resistance. They had lots of, community meetings. They had all kinds of angry parents, but of course they weren't racist. They were just, worried about neighborhood schools and things like that. And unfortunately, what happened is, like, they went forward with, the rezoning plans, to deal with the overcrowding schools, but they actually scratched the school pairing, and the integration plan. So they still kind of worked on alleviating the overcrowding part, but they didn't do anything about integration. So Richmond's going to continue being a very segregated place, and probably even more segregated as we continue. And that, we want to say, oh, that was Virginia, but very similar ideas, are happening all over. Or Montgomery County, or Maryland, which is the county just outside of DC, where I'm from. In 2019, kind of very similar thing happened. We started realizing that Montgomery County realized that their schools, one, they had the same issues. All the rich white schools were overcrowded, and they needed to do something. All the poor black schools weren't overcrowded, but they realized that majority of the poor black people were all in one school, or all in schools, in segregated schools, while the majority of, like, white well-off people were in other segregated schools. So they realized they had massive segregation, and really there was Anaya Tadaganta, I think. I apologize if I mispronounced that name, but she was a student board member, and she actually brought this up, and was, like, kind of leading the charge. And she writes, although we cannot address housing patterns or solve social, economic, and inequity challenges within our country, we can or county, we can examine how such factors might impact or be mitigated by how school boundaries are drawn, or where academic programs are placed, and provide the board with the opportunity to be intentional in creating equitable learning environments that leverage the assets in Montgomery County. So again, she's, like, acknowledging, it's like, yeah, we can't fix all this past redlining and housing discrimination. Hopefully somebody will, but we can't. But at the same time, we can mitigate a lot of this through our, desegregating our schools, which really, yeah, it challenges that assumption that we're all victims of housing discrimination, and this is just how it has to be. So they came up with a rezoning plan. They didn't use pairing, but they came up with idea of doing busing programs. So they had two parts: one to fix the overcrowding, and one to fix the segregation. So I'll read this quote. This is from the article "Are Bad Boundaries Spurring Equity in Montgomery Counties?" It says, generally, the lower percentage of students eligible for free and reduced price meals, the school district's indicator of poverty, the better a school does on state and local assessments. So yeah, what they're saying is, when the less poor students are in the school, that they do better at state and local assessments. School boards have said that they want to create an equitable learning opportunity for all schools throughout the county, in part by diversifying schools. They also have said more diverse schools would help prepare students for the real world, where they will interact with people of different backgrounds. So this is the general idea: is they want to kind of mix up the schools. I don't want to have all the poor students in one school and all the black schools, black students in one school, and then all the well-off white kids in another. They want to, integrate it so everyone's invested in all these schools. Again, they had massive white parent resistance. A lot of them used, neighborhood schools. A lot of them talked about how, forced busing was bad, and, like, how bad that was going to be to actually send their kids on busing when, people are busing all over, so they had that massive resistance, but and this time, though, they actually kind of overcame. They went ahead. Well, I want to talk real quick. So there was, like, one middle school. It was, like, mainly a black poor middle school, Neesville Middle School, and all the parents were like, we don't want to send our white parents were like, we don't want to send our kids to this school. This school is, it has a lot of issues, and it's just not, a quality school. And so they, again, their opposition was like, why don't we just fund this, school equally? And keep it a black school. But again, one, that's unconstitutional, and two, no matter how much they fund that school, it will never be equal to a white school. That's just how these things work. If there was actually a black school that was, like, adequately funded and like a white school, that would be a huge case study. But no one's really found that circumstance. So, but again, I mean, that was their out. It was like, oh, let's just fund the black schools, adequately. But they only say that when their students are actually being, when there's a proposal that actually says that let's send white kids' parents, white students to these schools. All of a sudden, people want to fund it. No one even cared about funding the school until the notion that their white kids might actually show up. So that's proof that integration works, and that's the only way that we're going to have adequately funded schools and equally funded schools. And so I'll read this quote by Toni Kamali. She writes, there are numerous examples of white and or wealthy parents in local governments working diligently to preserve the status quo by altering or refusing to change their school boundaries, including in neighborhood DC and Virginia. Even the so-called progressive Montgomery County data shows that our high schools are de facto segregated. Buying a house is a huge financial investment, and many parents in Montgomery County will freely admit they choose where to buy a house based on its NCPS cluster. So that's the school system. And NCPS leaders are no doubt aware of the deluge of parents, parent-teacher associations, and other groups that would oppose any change to the status quo. However, Montgomery County leaders' decision in 2008 to spend vast sums of money to keep expanding schools that are already above capacity while refusing to consider minor changes to boundary lines only further cement the current state of school gerrymandering. So that was in response to 2018. Everyone knew how segregated the schools were, but the Montgomery County, school systems leaders were like, well, let's just spend a massive amount of money, opening up, building more infrastructure at these like overcrowded white schools instead of let's just change the boundaries and have some of these white students go to these undercrowded black schools. So and overall, they actually they actually went forward with the Montgomery County rezoning plan. Unfortunately, this was right before COVID hit, so I don't know where they are exactly right now, but yeah, the commission actually supported and voted for the rezoning plan. So we'll see how that plays out.